Good morning. I'd like to take some time and work through Francis Fukuyama's 1989 essay, The End of History. This is the first of several paradigms that I'm going to ask you to read and think about in this course. And I think it's without a doubt the most difficult. It's difficult because on the one hand, it's very technical in terms of the language of political theory. On the other hand, it's difficult because it's very abstract. And then thirdly, it's difficult because it was written 21 years ago, and yet it still has kind of a very sort of in-depth, fully engaged current events perspective to it as well. So the headlines have passed without a doubt, and the ideas have been challenged without a doubt, even, as we will learn, by Fukuyama himself. Yet nonetheless, this is a good place to start a course on understanding the global political arena. As I said, this essay came out in 1989, and in particular came out in the summer of 1989, which I'm always kind of impressed by, given that that would be several months before the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November, which I think in a lot of people's minds captured or symbolized the collapse of the communist system and the end of the Cold War as a whole. But 1989 was a pivotal year for more reasons than just the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in fact, the late 80s and early 1990s were important in general beyond the context of the Cold War because, as Fukuyama suggests, they symbolized a kind of great, if not indeed final, transformation away from an era of ideological conflict and toward a time of increasing liberalization. So we'll talk about what exactly he means by liberalization in just a moment. But to just kind of set the historical stage a little bit, bear in mind that the late 80s and early 1990s were a time of the democratic uprisings in China, in Tiananmen Square, the death of the Shia fundamentalist cleric Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, and the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa, and the emergence of Nelson Mandela as the first president of a democratic and multiracial South Africa. Throughout the 1980s, you had democratic and sort of, I wouldn't go so far as to say pro-Western, but definitely anti-Soviet uprisings throughout Eastern Europe. In Poland, you had the Solidarity movement, and then there were similar movements afoot as well in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, the violent revolution, the overthrow of Ceausescu in Romania, and then the outbreak of democratic movements in the Baltic states as well. All kind of led a number of scholars, including Fukuyama, to try to put this into a greater context and a paradigm, if you will. And the paradigm that Fukuyama came up with was that this was the end of history. Now, let's go back for just a minute and remind ourselves that although he would follow these ideas up several years later with a more definitive and more thorough statement called The End of History and the Last Man, in 1989, anyway, he put a question mark at the end of this term as if to kind of tentatively suggest that this could indeed be the moment where we have arrived. So, although these ideas have since been challenged by other scholars, as we've seen or will see, and even Fukuyama himself would go back and revise them off and on throughout the ensuing 20 years, still, the end of history as a concept is a great place to start for the beginning of understanding the global political arena, which is actually the title of our course. So anyway, let's get into it. As difficult as this essay is, you can actually understand the gist of it just by reading the first page, okay? So it might be useful if you have your essay in front of you and we can take a quick look at some of these more important paragraphs. In the second paragraph, after kind of introducing the moment, like I've already done, he says that there's a process at work here in the late 20th century that gives coherence and order to the daily headlines. And then he goes into a bit of a historical summary of the 20th century. He says the 20th century saw the developed world descend into a paroxysm or a spasm of ideological violence as liberalism contended first with the remnants of absolutism, then Bolshevism and fascism, and finally an updated Marxism that threatened to lead to the ultimate apocalypse of nuclear war. But the century that began full of self-confidence in the ultimate triumph of Western liberal democracy seems at its close to be returning full circle to where it started, not to an end of ideology or a convergence between capitalism and socialism as had earlier been predicted, but to an unabashed victory of economic and political liberalism. Now, we're going to have to unpack this paragraph a little bit because it's chock full of meaning. First of all, when he says the 20th century saw the developed world descend into a paroxysm of ideological violence, liberalism contending first with the remnants of absolutism, that's actually a reference to World War I, which happened from 1914 to 1918, and the fact that in World War I, there were ideological forces at work which for the first time really kind of took on a global significance. That's of course why it's called World War I, even though it was at the time called the Great War. It wasn't actually called World War I until the even greater conflict of World War II had been put to rest in the mid-40s. But anyway, you might remember from a previous history class that you've taken in college or high school or somewhere else in life that in World War I, President Woodrow Wilson was reluctant to engage in the conflict because he was a progressive, he was a liberal, if you will, a Democrat, and as such, he saw war as folly. He saw war as a preventable, pointless tragedy. And so he actually was reelected in 1916, 2 years into the war, under the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But by the middle of 1917, I'm going to have